my name is Jack Condi, and this is my presentation on the Aerospike rocket motor. To first understand the Aerospike rocket motor, we first have to understand how a traditional rocket motor functions. This diagram is a general overview and slash generalization of how a rocket motor functions. So first you have the turbopump assembly, which is a series of pumps and tubes that take the propellants from the tanks in the rocket and feeds them into the combustion chamber. You may ask, how does the turbopump gain the energy to do this? And that's from the preburner, which is a mini gas generator which powers the turbopump. And it also has an exhaust. This exhaust only happens on an open cycle rocket motor, which is a topic we won't delve into today. You also have the combustion chamber, which is where the propellants are ignited, the throat, and the nozzle. So how do rocket motors produce thrust? Well, there are many propellants that can be used to power a rocket. The most common propellants used are RP1, which is a highly refined kerosene, hydrogen, and methane. These propellants are then combined with liquid oxygen, or LOX for short, to allow for combustion at high altitudes in the vacuum of space where there is little to no oxygen. Some rockets utilize hypergolic fuels, which ignite on contact and therefore require no outside ignition source, simplifying the rocket motor. So the most common used hypergolic fuels are hydrazine, N2H4, and monomethylhydrazine, CH3NHNH2. However, these fuels are extremely carcinogenic and toxic, and so therefore they're not used on rockets meant to transport humans and are becoming more and more rare in the modern rocket industry. So a quick fun fact is that if you were watching the recent SpaceX launch of their Falcon 9 rocket, which was the first time humans have launched from American soil in 9 years, you may have noticed the large clouds of condensation coming from the rocket only minutes before launch. Don't worry, this is all meant to be, as SpaceX uses super chilled liquid oxygen. The reason SpaceX uses super chilled liquid oxygen is because it becomes much more dense at these low temperatures. This allows them to fit more of this into their tanks, allowing for more combustion. However, as the rocket is sitting on the pad warming up, some of the liquid oxygen begins to become a gas again. And therefore, inside the tank, the pressure is building up, meaning SpaceX has to vent this liquid oxygen off. And therefore, you see the large clouds of condensation. So how do rocket motors produce thrust? Part 2. Well, regardless of the propellants that the rocket uses, the process for combining the propellant and oxidizer can be relatively generalized for most all rocket motors. There are a lot of discrepancies, however, it would take a very large presentation to get into all of them. Well, first, high-pressured propellant and oxidizer are released from the tanks and enter the turbopump assembly, which feeds the propellant and oxidizer into the combustion chamber. So these propellants and oxidizers are ignited and then fed through the throat. Well, the throat, as you recall, is a small diameter hole after the combustion chamber, and this makes the exhaust gases super high pressure and also speeds them up, and therefore they exit the nozzle at high speeds, creating the required thrust. Well, you may ask, what purpose does the nozzle serve? At the throat of the combustion chamber, propellants are at extremely high pressures. And so the nozzle also serves to speed up and therefore lower the pressure of the exhaust gases. The ratio of the diameter of the throat of the rocket to the diameter of the nozzle is called the expansion ratio. And rocket motors optimized for the use in the vacuum of space often have the largest expansion ratios of any rocket. This is perfectly demonstrated by the diagram on the right. The rocket motor on the left is the Merlin 1D, which SpaceX uses 9 of these on the first stage of the Falcon 9. These are optimized for use at sea level and most realms of the atmosphere. On the right is the same exact rocket motor. However, SpaceX uses this one on the second stage of its Falcon 9. In the second stage of most rocket motors are used in the vacuum of space, where the ambient air pressure is extremely low. And so you can see the nozzle of this rocket is extremely large. In fact, it's 2.7 meters in diameter. So this leads us on to the next topic, which is ambient air pressure and the efficiency of rockets. Well, rockets are the most efficient when their thrust is focused in a straight line. Think of this like how a garden hose water stream becomes stronger when you put your thumb over the hose. This is because before you put your thumb over the hose, the water stream was spread out over a large area, meaning less of the water pressure is concentrated. However, when you put your thumb over the hose, all of that water pressure is concentrated in one smaller area. So at sea level and lower altitudes, the ambient air pressure is sufficient to keep the exhaust gases in a straight line with a small nozzle, because as you recall, a nozzle serves to speed up and also lower the pressure of the exhaust gases. However, nearing the vacuum of space and higher altitudes, the air pressure drops dramatically, meaning the exhaust gases no longer have the air pressure to keep them in a straight line behind the rocket motor. So if you were to use a sea level optimized nozzle, the exhaust gases would be at too high of a pressure and would expand over a larger area. So to generalize this, the closer the pressure of the exhaust through the atmospheric pressure, the more efficient the motor. So that's why you see extremely large nozzles on vacuum optimized rocket engines. That's because the exhaust gases are at a lower pressure when you have a larger nozzle. So this also leads us on to flow separation. You may ask, since rockets spend most of the time where the air pressure is extremely minimal, why are vacuum optimized nozzles not used for all stages of the rocket? Well, this is relatively easily answered with this. A nozzle too large for a given air pressure will cause a phenomenon known as flow separation. Flow separation is when the exhaust gases of the rocket are at too low of a pressure from the large nozzle. And so this causes the air pressure around the exhaust gases to cause shock waves in the exhaust gases and travel up back into the rocket motor, which can be catastrophic, leading to an explosion. The diagram at the right demonstrates this perfectly. You can see in the two bottom pictures you have an overexpanded nozzle and a grossly overexpanded nozzle. They both show that the pressure of the atmosphere is much larger than the pressure of the exhaust gases. And you can see in the bottom image, this is most greatly demonstrated, where the exhaust gases are not even filling up the entire nozzle, meaning shockwaves travel back up in the nozzle, causing an explosion. So this leads us on to a study in that flow processes in an overexpanded chemical rocket nozzles. This study in 1984, performed by NASA, found that flow separation will occur when the exit pressure of the nozzle is anywhere between 20 to 50% below the ambient air pressure, which is a lot of range and means that nozzles have to be perfectly optimized. The solution to this? Well, first developed in the 1960s, the Aerospike rocket motor promised a solution to varying altitude inefficiencies. So at the bottom you have two of these aerospikes, which is the linear aerospike and the cone aerospike. So how does the aerospike achieve this? Well, by forcing exhaust gases down the ramp of the aerospike and letting the ambient air pressure dictate the other side of the exhaust pattern, the aerospike's nozzle effectively expands at higher altitudes. Well, you may ask, what is the aerospike's nozzle? The aerospike's nozzle is formed by the outside side of the gases and the ramp. So these exhaust gases are also accelerating while traveling down the ramp of an aerospike, while also decreasing in pressure. So it's very similar to how a traditional rocket motor functions. However, it effectively adapts to the ambient air pressure. This leads us on to another study, which is the design and optimization of aerospike nozzle using CFD. This study, performed through computer simulations and data gathered from static fire tests of aerospikes, determined that aerospikes save between 25 to 30% more fuel at low altitudes than a traditional Bell nozzle. However, there are a lot of limitations that come with aerospikes. Aerospikes still face the issue of thrust expansion at higher altitudes, as they are limited by the length of the ramp. As you may recall, the length of the ramp lowers the pressure of the exhaust gases. Aerospikes also require the use of mini combustion chambers placed along the length of the ramps, in the case of a linear aerospike, or around the circumference of a cone aerospike. This dramatically increases the weight of the rocket motor. And weight of the rocket motor is extremely important in rockets, as thrust to weight ratio determines how effective and efficient a rocket motor can be. This leads us on to the main problem with aerospikes. The main problem is cooling the aerospike. The throat of the rocket motor faces the greatest challenge to cool. This is because high pressure, recently ignited gases are constantly flowing through this small diameter. So aerospikes effectively have a throat that spans the entire length or circumference of the motor, meaning engineers have to develop costly solutions to cooling the motor, which also greatly add to the weight of the motor. So in conclusion, while Aerospike rocket motors promise a solution to traditional rocket motors that become inefficient at higher altitudes, many companies that have pursued Aerospikes have come to the conclusion that the added weight and complexity of the cooling systems required devalues what the Aerospike offers in thrust efficiency.